Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today with Amelia. Today, we are going to be talking about being a career changer and how that plays into the job hunt. You may know that this is the fourth week in a series of webinars that Udacity has held to prepare you for the job hunt. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We'll be talking to Amelia, a product manager of the careers team, about making the jump into a new career path. Amelia is an experienced career changer several times over and will be sharing her top strategies from experience that works and what doesn't to get your foot in the door and make a switch. So during the next hour, we are going to be holding the session Q&A style. So Amelia will give a quick introduction about her and her journey to where she is now, and then we're going to dive right into questions that students pre-submitted. And if you have a question for Amelia, you can just stick it in the chat and we'll try and get to it. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Amelia so she can introduce herself.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. Really excited to chat about the topic of making a career change. It's definitely one that's sort of near and dear to my heart. I am a product manager here at Udacity, and I specifically focus on the area of our product that we call careers internally, which is sort of the products and services that are offered specifically to help you not only master technical content, but make that extra jump into landing a job. So for me personally, there's a lot of there's a lot that I relate to and why I'm sort of excited about this particular area because as mentioned, I'm a career changer myself several times over. So I certainly didn't start in software or tech. And if you had told me that I'd be a product manager in software, I wouldn't have even known what that was. I was a physics major in undergrad. I worked in academic lab research. I worked on this stuff called nanotechnology, which is like very, 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 very small things. And the first career switch that I made was from academic lab research into marketing in internet technology startups. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty big, that was already a pretty big jump. So that was sort of my first experience of, how do you make a switch? And at the time, I really wanted to do that because I was getting really curious about startups and in particular about the business side of startups, not just the technology, but I wanted to learn more about things like sales and marketing, but I also had no idea what they really were. So then I worked in a very small, right after graduation, I worked in a very small startup here in Mountain View, actually. It was about 17 people and maybe about 30 people by the time that I left. It was called Lexity, and we did we made online marketing tools for small businesses. After that, I worked at a startup called Optimizely, which is based in San Francisco. We make A/B testing software. And at Optimizely, I was a marketing automation specialist. So I continued to sort of stay in the marketing world and specialized in sort of quantitative type marketing. Optimizely went through a very, very rapid growth period while I was there. It was maybe about 45 people when I joined, and a year and a half later, it was at 250. So that was a really interesting time to kind of get to be there and see what that was like. After that, I actually went and did an MBA for 2 years. And that was the first time ever, really, that product management was suggested to me. I had a couple of friends and mentors who knew that what I get really excited about is sort of working in both the technical and non-technical sides of a business. A couple people mentioned to me, said, have you ever thought about product management? And it never crossed my mind. So I kind of dismissed it like the first couple times that people brought it up to me. And then probably like the fourth or fifth time somebody brought it up to me, I was like, oh, I guess I should look at this thing. So that was the second career change that I decided to make, was to transition out of marketing into product management, which is also not like a super common kind of switch to make. And then after that, I was lucky enough to sort of land a product management job here at Udacity, where I've been for the last 2.5 years. So that's a bit about me.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing, Amelia. That's a lot of things I didn't know. And I think it's really a relatable experience because I think a lot of our students aren't coming from the tech world, and it can be intimidating making that transition. And I love that you were just curious about what it was like to work for a startup, and that's how you ended up there. So next we're going to dive into our questions that were pre-submitted by students. And then again, if you have any questions while you're listening to Amelia, please put them in the chat and we will get to them. So the first question I have for you is, it's a long one. How can I overcome the lack of experience? I've been to multiple interviews that go well, and they're impressed by my personal projects, or maybe Udacity projects, but they don't go with me because I don't have any background experience. I spend months working on my portfolio to get an interview, then weeks preparing for coding questions. What can I do differently?
That's I feel like that's at the crux of so many career change kind of journeys is, how do I convince somebody to give me a chance when nothing in my background on my resume has this, in my title? So there's actually a lot that we can go into here. So I'll probably kind of start out with a little bit, and then I'll kind of pass it back to you to see if we want to dive even more into any bits of this, or if other questions are kind of touching on similar topics. There's really a lot that we can go into here. But for your particular experience, because you're actually getting all the way to the interview stage, that's usually a pretty good sign, because it at least means that you're not getting stuck at that first initial gate, right, of just like the resume screen. So first of all, give yourself a pat on the back for that. You're getting to the interview stage, which means that like you're definitely piquing interest and you're doing well in initial conversations. I always tell people that there's really no like downside to sort of following up and seeing how much the company will give you in terms of feedback as to why they ultimately haven't gone with you. So if you're getting the sense that it's because of lack of experience, if you can get any more details from them, just be like, hey, wanted to follow up and see, what are some areas that you would like to see some growth from me in? You mentioned that you'd like to see some more experience from me. You might be able to get a little bit more out of them. Is it that they are like, well, we'd like to see, specifically, we want to see more experience where you have collaborated with other developers on a team? Or is it that like, we're really looking for somebody with a little bit more international experience because we're looking to expand our product globally, and that's kind of something that we want to see? Or is it like, we work in the e-commerce industry, and so we're looking for somebody with a little bit more experience there. So you might be able to get just like a little bit more information out of them. And then if you do this over several interviews, you can kind of tell from the feedback that's coming in if you're seeing any trends of like, oh, and this is the thing to work on. I need to convince them that I can work well with other developers. Then there's like whole other sets of strategies for, okay, well then how do I go and like acquire that experience or explain that I already have that experience? But for your case in particular, because you're already getting to the interview stage, I would encourage you to take that extra step. The worst they're going to say is, sorry, that's all the information we can give you. There's really not too much like harm in asking. But in general, the bigger question of just how do I convince somebody to give me a chance, when they think that I don't have prior experience, I think is still a larger topic that we can dive into outside of your particular situation. And one of the biggest things that I always tell, this is probably, I don't know when is the last time that I've had a conversation on this topic that I did not bring this up. That your goal is to show somebody that you actually do have the experience. It just wasn't in your job title. So I'll say that again. Your job, right, is to show somebody that you've already done this job. It just wasn't in your previous job title. So that might sound a little mysterious, and I'll kind of deconstruct what that means. And again, a lot of this is coming from my own experience of having made career changes several times over, right? I say this because I tried a lot of different things, and I'm telling you what worked for me. Other things that didn't work. This is the thing that I want you to bet on. Okay, here's how this works. A lot of times it's about reframing how you yourself even look back at your prior accomplishments. Like really all the person on the other end cares about in the end is whether you can do the job. Like ultimately that's all anybody wants. They want somebody to like take this job and do great at it and knock it out of the park. And so if you can convince them, and usually, right, like a shortcut to determining that is to look at somebody's prior work history and say, okay, you've been an Android developer for 1 year or 2 years or whatever, right? But in absence of that, if you can show them that you've actually already done all of this and like that is, you know, it just wasn't in your title, that is really the best thing that you have going for you as a career changer. So I'll give a really concrete example of how it worked for me. Okay. So I was switching from marketing into product management. I had absolutely nothing in my prior work history that said product or manager in that case, for that matter, anywhere in my work history. Okay, and product management is like, I mean, it's a fairly competitive like role. There's a lot of people who apply for it. There's not a ton of roles. So how in the world is I going to convince somebody, right, to take me seriously as a candidate? So first of all, I had to go learn what it was that people are looking for in terms of skills for the job. And we can't, so I'll put a pin in that because that's a whole other topic that we can also dig into. But I knew, like, let's say that, you know, fast forward a bit and I have my list of like, okay, I know that what a product manager does is they have to launch things. They have to do user research and figure out what customers want. They need to react to customer feedback and prioritize what it is that you're going to do and what it's not going to do. They need to work with engineering teams, you know, work with design teams, where I have this checklist of what are these core skills that a product manager needs. And I basically had to go back and look at my own work history. Because if I looked at my resume of what it is that I was writing on my, like, you know, on my materials, it was all about my marketing accomplishments, right? Like everything was talking about like, this is a super successful campaign, like, you know, it drove this many conversions, blah, blah, blah. And it makes sense that that's what I was doing because that's what I had been told my accomplishments were. That's what my manager compliments me on. That's what I get my, like, you know, bonus for, is all these marketing accomplishments. And when I was working in marketing automation, I signed up to do this company hackathon. It's like a 2-week hackathon. So I was like one of the only people on the marketing team who knew how to code at all. And I got together with some friends on the engineering team, and I pulled in a friend who was a designer, and I pulled in a friend who was a PM. And I was like, hey, there's like this feature that the customers have been asking for forever. Let's actually build it. Let's do it. And so in this 2-week hackathon, right, we actually did it. We put together this thing. It was an A/B testing calculator. We pitched it to leadership, and we actually got it out there. And it was like the number 4 ranked A/B testing calculator on the internet for some time, right? Did I put that anywhere on my marketing resume? No, that was just like a cool thing that I did on the side. But I realized that when I was applying for a product management job, this thing that in my head I thought of as a random side project, right, actually became the crux of a lot of my conversations about applying to be a product manager. I would bring this up over and over again in conversations. This was like a whole topic that I would discuss in an interview, was how did I decide that that was the right problem? Like, you know, how did we end up designing it? How did we pull together like this, you know, this interdisciplinary team? How did I pitch it to leadership? How did I get it out there? How did I measure the success metrics? And like, you know, how did it perform after launch, which turned out was actually pretty good. And so this thing that, anyway, right, that I previously sort of discounted and said, oh, this is like not a big deal, it actually mapped extremely well to the kinds of skills that I was trying to demonstrate I already had, right? So then the whole story then became not about like, well, Amelia, you haven't been a product manager before. It became about me saying like, look, I've actually done all these pieces, all the pieces that you're looking for in a product manager. I've done it before. It just wasn't in my title. And that was just one example, but I ended up doing the same thing where I had built this like side project, where it's like a website where there's a community for women where we could like post and rate digital tech products and stuff. And yeah, I like put it together myself from different like open source libraries, and you know, I'd come up with the concept myself, and I'd done a whole bunch of user testing. I'd like, you know, try to get some users, and I'd ask people what they wanted to see differently, and I'd try different things, and I like tweaked the whole layout based on, I mean, so it was again just something where I was like, yeah, I never would have thought of this as something to quote unquote brag about. But actually, this is like all this is all that they want to talk about now. Like the recruiters and the hiring managers I'm talking to for product manager, they want to talk about these little things that I thought were side projects. And so I ended up making that the center of all of my applications. Okay, so I'll kind of stop with that. I mean, this is just like the tip of the iceberg, but this is probably the most common thing that I tell people is to take a really critical eye and go back and look at all of the things that you've done previously and reframe them in terms of, I actually do have experience with all these things that you're asking for. I do, right? It just wasn't in my name. And the last thing I'll say on this is that you shouldn't expect it to happen immediately. Like it probably took me a good 2 weeks of reflection and effort to make that switch in how I was applying to product management jobs, which is totally normal. We're not used to it, right? I was so used to thinking of myself as I'm a marketing person and these are my accomplishments. And if somebody asks me, what are my professional achievements? These are the things that I'm going to rattle off. And so it does take some practice and some time to like dig through like what were all the things that I did in those previous 2 to 3 years, and just things that I had forgotten about or that I would have just dismissed out of hand. And I think that one thing you can do to really help with that is, one, just understand that it's going to take some time, schedule in time for yourself to do that reflection, but two, find some partners in your life who can help you think of those things. Things like, your friends, your family, your partner. Ask them to help you go through all the accomplishments that you've done and to help you think of what else it is that you're missing that could potentially be fodder for this. Because you'll find, I think, a lot of times that the people who love us and care about us are kinder to us than we are to ourselves, right? So I would be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to talk about that little project I did for the sales team. That was just like a, whatever. And, my boyfriend would say like, no, that was actually super cool. Like that was a real achievement. Like, don't throw that away. So I find that having somebody else to sort of bounce off of is really helpful in sort of doing this. So anyway, I don't want to take up too much time on this one particular point, but I'll stop there for now.
I think you're totally right. I think that is the crux of the issue. And how do you, and this is actually the next question, and I think I've already been talking about it, but is how do you tell a different narrative than the one that you have in your head, or that you think the recruiter has of you? How do you own your story and share it in a way that is appealing for the position you're looking for? So the question that I have is, so when changing careers, how do you tell a convincing story for the employer to hire you for that new role?
Yeah. So also, I think a really big topic that kind of sits at the heart of career changing, and also one where I feel like hopefully what I have learned through my experience can benefit others. So I have two pieces to this. One is like, some basic building blocks for how you put that story together and sort of the key pieces that people are going to be looking for. And the second one that I'll talk about is how do you turn your background, especially if it's not sort of the most cookie cutter traditional background, into that role? How do you turn it into an asset instead of thinking about it as a liability? Okay. So the first one that we'll talk about, that story. Okay. I'll give another real world example. So this was me going from lab research into marketing at startups, which, as you can imagine, most of the time when I told people that, they would just be completely baffled as to why that would make sense, right? And so, a lot of the telling a compelling narrative, right, is really about helping somebody understand why this actually makes sense to you. So a lot of times it's like, well, they don't see it, but this actually makes a lot of sense. And it's my job as the applicant to help them understand that. It's not their job to somehow read my mind and like understand my whole history and figure this out. It's my job to tell that story. Okay. So let me tell you how this would work. Because people would be like, so you're looking for a marketing job and you're a physics major and you have no background in marketing. So tell me, why is this something that we should hire you for at our startup? A very reasonable question. Okay, so this is how so the thing that I would say is it's funny because it does seem like these are two pretty different worlds. But at the core of it, it's actually the same thing that drives me in both. Like, what I really get excited about is building awesome stuff from scratch with other people who love the same things around like technology. Like I love creating something from nothing. And that's what drew me to lab research in physics, where I get to see like great technology that we're working on all the time that could be used like for future applications. But it's also what gets me super excited about startups too. Okay, so that's the first piece of the story, is help somebody see why these things actually have more in common than they may realize. So like, for example, at Udacity, I have calls with students all the time about their various job searches, right? And you wouldn't believe like the incredible range of background that people come from, like totally random like professions. But if you ask them, do you think there's anything in common between being a whatever it is, like software developer and your current role as a high school teacher? 100% of the time, people will be able to say, actually, yes, there are some things that are very similar where it actually feels like the same. you know, there are always common. And if I ask you, why do you get excited about both things? Why did you originally become a teacher, and why do you want to become a software developer? It is amazing how many times people say like, I didn't really think about it, but I guess like, I really like whatever it is, like I really like building things piece by piece. And that's what drew me. I love that part of putting a curriculum together. And I love that part of breaking down an engineering problem, right? Okay, so that's the first piece, is to identify what is actually the connection between these things? Why is it that you have been excited about things in the past and that still carries forward to what it is that you want to do in the future? The second piece that you need to now explain to a potential employer is, so why are you changing? Okay, so I would have, right? So I would explain to people this whole like, there's actually a very common thread between everything that's ever like excited me really career-wise in the past, and so it makes sense. But what I saw in my physics research labs was I saw people spending years and years and years of their graduate study working on these amazing technologies that would never leave the four walls of this academic institution, or might possibly never leave the four walls of this academic institution. Right? People were really great at coming up with that initial technology and the initial ideas, but when they tried to actually move it to market, and some of them would try to do that, they would inevitably fail, because it turns out that the skill sets, right, for coming up with cool technology are not necessarily the same skill sets that you need to actually go out and make like a thriving business. And that's what piqued my interest in saying like, well, I want to better understand like, what are these other mysterious businessy things that I don't get right now, but are clearly so crucial to the success or failure of these ideas that I'm so passionate about trying to nurture. And that's what I want to learn more about. And that's where my interest in kind of understanding more about like sales and marketing is coming from. And that's why I want to dive into startups, because this is the hotbed of like, you got to do or die. Some businesses live, some businesses fail. Like, I want to be part of that. And I want to understand like what makes that tick. So those are the two pieces. Find the commonality, then explain why this next step actually makes sense for you, because there was something that wasn't quite being fulfilled in your previous role, but this one is gonna open the door for you. Okay, so that's the first piece about sort of this narrative. This just helps it makes sense to somebody else, like why you're even doing this, because if they're just distracted thinking it makes no sense that this lab research person now wants to work in marketing at startups, they're just going to be focused on that, and they're not going to be focused on looking at your application or trying to understand you as a person or like anything else, because they're just stuck at like this step one. So the second piece that I wanted to get into is, okay, so you're coming from this non-traditional background. How do you stop thinking about your background as a liability and turn it into an asset for yourself? And I really do think that a lot of this is about internal mindset. It really is. And that's good news, because it means that it's not like there is some objective truth out there that is like, that previous path you took is just bad, right? I really do think that a lot of it is influenced by how you, as the applicant, look at yourself and how you are confident about what you can bring to the table and how you think you can bring something unique. And then again, it's sort of on you as the applicant. It's your responsibility to help a recruiter or hiring manager see that. So let me go back to the same concrete example, right? So again, okay, so now I've gotten past the story part of explaining why this transition from physics research to marketing and startups makes sense. Okay, what can I say about my background that might be like kind of unique, right? So for me, I really leaned on the fact that like, what is something that I'm going to have in my background as a physics lab researcher that maybe not every other applicant is going to have? So my pitch was, look, I'm really comfortable with quantitative stuff. Like, I'm good with numbers. I'm good with problem solving. If you have something that involves like a lot of data, a lot of numbers, I think I'm going to be exceptionally good at that, because that's what I've done for like plenty of years sitting in lab, is like collecting and pouring through like reams of data that we're collecting on how like research is going. And that indeed ended up being the first like marketing job that I got, was super data oriented. They were like, oh yeah, we have a whole bunch of extra spreadsheets that nobody has had time to go look at. Why don't we just like throw them at you and see what you can pull out of them? Okay. So pull, you know, or what was another, I was talking to another thing that I'll often advise people is, let's say, so I was talking to a student the other day who, I'll use the same student. So this student was a high school teacher, and he was going from that into wanted to move into software development. And so I suggested to him, I said, look, another advantage that you can use, right, to give yourself an extra leg up is go talk to companies that work in education. Because then suddenly you have this extra thing that you can bring to the table as a developer, because you're going to be like, you know what, I was actually a teacher for many years. I'm going to be somebody who's not just sitting there writing code. I actually understand the industry that you work in. That's something that not just any developer that comes to your door can say, right? Like, I actually know what it's like. I know who your users are, like especially if it's like, you know, the product is for teachers or schools or whatever, right? It's like, I actually understand your users. I understand your business problems. And I can definitely tell you that from a company's point of view, like a software developer who can understand that is like, that's a rare thing that you can bring to the table. And you can use that for whatever previous industry you've worked in, you know, whether it's healthcare or a restaurant business or whatever it is, right? Like, if you're smart about targeting companies who work in those industries, suddenly your background becomes a distinctive asset that other people can't compete with. Anyway, so I probably talked long enough on that topic, so I'll pause there. We can always go more into any of these.
No, that was great. That was perfect. There's actually a student who wrote in who is a teacher. Career change, so that was a good example to use.
Right.
So the next question we have submitted is, can you utilize references or awards such as Employee of the Month to show how you would be successful in this new role? Which I think you've touched on, that this idea that you can use your skills from a job that may seem unrelated in a new position. I guess the question is, can you use the same career references, and can you even if that you're awarded something for a skill that might not be related, can you still translate that in some way to this new position?
It's not like it's bad to list it, but it's going to be a lot stronger if you can think of accomplishments that are going to map closer to skills. And I know that the first reaction is going to be like, but I don't have any of those. And I am going to say, like, I'll push you and challenge you to say, like, they might be there and you're just not thinking of them as awards in that way. So for example, like, just to give like another example, so I mentioned that when I was at Optimizely as working in marketing automation, I did the company hackathon, right? I also did this other random hackathon once, like outside of the company. It was like, I forget I don't even remember what it was called. But anyway, we were like building some little, I ended up building this widget that would like automatically create bookshelves for you on Goodreads, which is this like social network. Anyway, we don't need to get into the details of what exactly it was, right? But again, I just never would have even given it a moment's thought to consider that or anything related to that. Like an accomplishment, I probably would have been thinking of my marketing job and how I got things like employee of the month, or, like some kind of thing where I got to stand on stage and, I got some sort of shout out from everybody. And what ended up actually happening in my job application search was that I ended up calling out. I was like, well, at this hackathon, I was like, one of the most top voted like projects built or something like that. And then I think I also said for the Optimizely hackathon, I was like, this was this is the first hackathon project out of the whole company that actually got launched to like the market. Like our little hackathon project actually became like this feature that the company supported. I didn't get an award for that at the time. I didn't get any sort of like shout out for that at the time. It's just a fact. It just happened to be the first hackathon project that, was launched. It wasn't an award, but it has a lot more to do with the job that I'm applying for. And so even though those things aren't like accomplishments that, whatever, were made a big fuss over at the same time, like those actually are things that, set me apart, even in that small circle of like, okay, well, whatever, there are probably like at least 5 hackathon projects and ours is the first one that was launched and possibly the only one that was launched. I'm going to make a bigger deal of that because I know that building products and launching them is a bigger deal in product manager world than like the performance of an email marketing campaign. I might still mention the email campaign. I think you just also have to understand that like, it just might not be what is as interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And we got another question in while you were talking that I think is relevant to a lot of students. I've gotten this question a lot myself, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, or maybe experience you have. But a student, again, said they were a IT teacher and would like to become a software developer. And someone told me that I need to start with something related to the industry, even if it's not developing. Would you recommend that they take a job related to the field, but maybe not their dream job or exactly what they're looking for, just to get that experience to put on their resume? Is that something you have done?
I guess it does. Of course, it all depends on how tangential this job is, because there are certainly things that like maybe are so tangential that you can't really see how that's going to be like a clear stepping stone. So I will caveat this. I like, well, I guess it depends how tangential this position is. I think there is benefit to being open to taking things on like contract jobs or freelance jobs or other random side projects or open source projects, or in this case, it sounds like, some other job where it might not be your ultimate goal. Like, maybe you're aiming for I want a full-time job that, is squarely in this field. But I only think that it's worth taking if you can get one of 2 things out of it. Okay, so one, and they both have to be relevant to the job that you're actually trying to get into. Okay, so one is if you can get like recommendations essentially. So the hardest part of any career change is really just getting that first foot in the door. It's amazing. Like once you get that first job, how everybody will suddenly assume that it is totally now so much more safer to offer you a job in this field, even though really you only have whatever, like 1 more year experience than you did a year ago. And you might not even be that different of a person. But for whatever reason, as humanity, we get really hung up on that, like, you know, prior experience. And so it is true that if you can find a way to sort of get your foot in the door, like even with a contract role or whatever, that it often does make the transition just substantially easier, sort of like disproportionately easier. Okay. So if you think you can get into the role and you can do like a knockout job, right? So you're gonna get really strong recommendations saying that like this person just you know, just so awesome. Like you should totally work with them. The second thing is if you think you're gonna get connections. So we haven't even gotten to this topic yet. And if we run out of questions, this is a whole area that we should probably dive into, but it's networking. Because networking is going to be one of the most powerful things you can do, especially as a career changer. Networking in general is super, super important for the job search. But as a career changer, it's even more important because getting an introduction to someone basically shortcuts you past all of those gates at the beginning. Like all the gates where you have to throw your resume in the ring with like 1,000 other people or whatever, you know, and you're like trying to game like, oh, what skills have to show up on my resume and what keywords are they going to be searching for and like all of that. If you have an introduction or a referral from somebody who has any sort of standing within the company, or it isn't even in the company, but they, you know, they somehow trust their opinion even the tiniest bit, and they say like, hey, you should talk to Amelia, you can bet like you're gonna get fast tracked through the application process. That doesn't mean you're guaranteed a job. It just means that you don't have to worry so much about getting stuck in all those little gates at the beginning. And those gates at the beginning tend to be like disproportionately, I think, tougher for career changers to get through. So, you know, if you're gonna get really good networking and like introductions to people through this job, or you're gonna get really good recommendations on the quality of your work, then maybe something worth considering. But I will say, I don't know, I'm probably a little bit of an idealist here, just like not to take the first thing that comes along, just because I don't know what your situation is. So certainly don't, you know, I'm in speculative world here, but it is like when you're a career changer, you're going to get offered a lot of jobs that seem like a little bit closer to your current role, because that's what people look at, right? They see your background and they're like, oh, cool, like so-and-so was an IT teacher, so I guess I can give them this thing and maybe seems sort of related. You're just going to get a lot more of those, but don't let that influence you into thinking that's all you know, can dream of getting. And I think it is worth giving it a real go for sure, at least for some period of time, for whatever the job is that you truly want. Of course, backup option, you know, some other related job that you can use as a stepping stone, but I was, you know, at least give it a shot. At least give it a shot.
I'm glad that you mentioned networking. We talked about that now 2 weeks ago for Career Month, and I think a lot of students were surprised to hear that 70% of people land their jobs through networking. And it's true. There are a lot of barriers you get over when you know someone and someone's able to attest to your work ethic or who you are. And so we have some resources on networking that we can, a webinar from 2 weeks ago that we can share in the chat for you guys as well. So the next question is, do you recommend applying to startups over larger companies as a place to get your foot in the door, or maybe there's more opportunity or they're more willing to work with career changers at a smaller company or a startup?
It's sort of a it's a tricky answer, because it's hard to give, I think, any sort of generalized answer to this that doesn't have like a bunch of exceptions. But I will say some pros and I will try to make some sort of like pros and cons about like as a career changer, sort of how you might approach like job search for a larger company versus like a smaller company. One of the things to consider, right, as you're doing this is well, let's see. Maybe I'll take a step back. I'll say generally for smaller companies, networking becomes even more important for a larger company. Networking is still helpful. I mean, honestly, it's helpful at any size company, but it's like even more valuable for a small company. And I'll go into in a minute as to why that is. That can swing either way in your favor. As a career changer, it may mean that you feel as though you have fewer connections in the industry. So maybe you feel like the networking route seems harder for me. So I guess that's going to be tough for me to break into. It also means that if you can step up your networking game, and I have a whole bunch of thoughts on like why I think networking is totally something that is learnable by anyone, and you don't have to think of yourself as a networker at all, then it's really going to play in your favor. And talking to small businesses or startups, you may find actually doors open much more quickly than you expect. So I put that out there. It kind of depends. You can say sort of like, oh, jelly, but like smaller or big companies. I tend to really gung-ho on people investing in their networking abilities, and I am somebody who never I hate working. I never thought of myself as like a networker. I just go in all those events where you just shake people's hands and trade cards, and it just feels like transactional and icky to me. And so for a long time, I just decided I was just bad at networking. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I realized it was very much this like mindset that I was kind of inflicting on myself, and that there were like much more positive ways to approach networking, that it could be something that I could really be good at and learn actually. And so now I would say I'm actually like much better at it, and I would never go through a job search now without doing a ton of networking. And so that is going to be like a big advantage for me if I were to do a career change, right, going into smaller company. So I'll also touch on briefly like why is this the case? Why is networking so much more effective at a smaller company? Why is it such a big part of the process? So I'll tell you from somebody who's been on the inside of several startups at this point. So the first one that I worked at, Lexity, was like 30 people, well, 17 people when I joined. Every single day, we're just putting out fires. You're just trying to keep the train running. Like your company may fall apart at any moment. You're just trying to make things work. And the last thing that anybody wants to do is to look at a pile of resumes that's like slowly building up on this desk on the side. Nobody feels like they have time for that. Everybody's like, oh yeah, we got to fix the latest thing that's broken. Like, we got to make this happen. We got to make that happen, because otherwise we're run out of money in a year and like we're going to die. And so if you present me with the choice as somebody who works at that startup of, so that inbox where there's like 100 resumes have been building up, you think you can take a couple of days and like go through that and try to see if you can interview somebody and read through all of those, versus, hey, my friend Sarah says that she knows like this killer designer and they're interested in working here. Like, you want to talk to them? You can bet what I'm going to sign up for. Like, and so if you do take the time to invest in your networking game, you're not even going to have to compete with so many other people who are in the hiring funnel. Because I'm going to talk to that person before I look at any of the resumes in that inbox. And I would say the same thing actually probably happened for me at Udacity. So I had like invested a lot of time. Like, I was interested in working at Udacity. I invested a lot of time in finding connections at Udacity beforehand. And Udacity is not even like that small of a startup. It's 500 people. Anyway, but I think I was considered for the position, for the product manager position, alongside 2 or 3 other candidates. And that job posting, I don't think ever even made it up on the Udacity website. Like, it never even was publicly advertised. It was like whoever could figure out how to get their name on the list, so that like whenever they were looking for a product manager position, they were like, oh yeah, that person Amelia. Somebody, like, I've had like several people mention her to me several times. So anyway, it can be extremely effective when applying to small companies.
Thanks, Amelia. The next question we have, and we'll try and squeeze as many as we can in. We about 12 minutes left. When someone's applying to a job, there's kind of two questions here. If they don't meet, what percentage of the requirements do you think they should meet before they apply? Or what if they like 90% of the job requirements, but 10% they're like, I don't really want to do that. What's your suggestion on like how much experience in the job requirements should they have? And then at what point should they say, no, this isn't going to be a good fit for me, or I don't have the experience to apply?
This is one where it's like, it kind of sucks how the world works, because you always see these lists in job posts of like, these are the requirements for the job. And the truth is, sometimes companies don't really mean it. Like, even though they have literally written there in plain text, this is required for the job, in reality, it's not required. But you as an applicant, the worst part is that you can't tell which ones are serious about it and which ones aren't. And I'll tell you, like, you may think like, oh, well, maybe that's the exception. Udacity is like that. We've hired people for jobs at Udacity that did not fit the bulleted list of requirements, right? And like, because even when people, sometimes I think companies do it intentionally, where they're like, well, this would be our ideal wish list, so I guess we'll just put that under the requirements section. But, and they don't really know how to say like, well, nice to have or whatever. But sometimes I do think it's genuinely because companies just don't know exactly like what it is they want. And so, they're kind of making their best guess as to what this list of requirements should look like. But if somebody really comes along who really speaks to them and the team really likes, and they're like, yeah, this person's going to be great. Sometimes they're like, well, okay, they don't fit 100% of the requirements, but we like this person. Or they'll be like, well, you don't fit 100% of the requirements for this level 3 engineer position, but let's adjust it down to level 2. And because we like you and we want to hire you, and we want to find some way to hire you. So, would you be willing to take a slightly adjusted title? Which has also happened here at Udacity. So anyway, all of this is to say that I generally say take a pretty optimistic view of what the requirements list really means. And if you think you're meeting 90% of the requirements, throw your hat in the ring. Either it's going to be a company who is going to say no to you anyway, because they actually were really serious about the requirements list. And then, okay, you end up with the same outcome you would have had before. Not really like a loss, just like the same. Or you're going to find that as a company is actually a little looser about the requirements. And then like you get this gain that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise because you threw your hat in the ring. So there are some things. So I spent all this time saying like, wow, it's so sucky. You can't tell in the world, like, when companies are more in this camp or in that camp. That's not entirely true. There is a little bit that you can do to try to figure out beforehand how serious people are about requirements, and also to give yourself a leg up. So one of the things that you can do is to look at the work histories of people who've been in that role. So for example, I was looking at product manager roles at Udacity. I went on LinkedIn and searched for people who are or have been product managers at Udacity. And I just go look at their backgrounds. And, so Udacity didn't, but like imagine if Udacity had said something in the requirements like, must have a CS degree or something like that, right? I can go look at all the product managers. You're like, do they have CS degrees? No, it doesn't really look like they all have CS degrees. Like, guessing that's probably a little flexible, right? So that's one thing that you can do that doesn't even need like assistance from anybody else, is to just go and research and see like, well, how serious are they about like having certain backgrounds? I think a lot of times you'll probably see that there's maybe a little more variety than you were expecting. The second thing is to actually talk to people. So I actually reached out to people who, I went on LinkedIn and looked for people who used to work at Udacity, not people who are current employees, people who used to work at Udacity in any function, doesn't need to be product management. I reached out to them to ask if they would chat with me. And some of them were product managers. And then it's like super informative for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, ex-employees tend to be a lot more honest than current employees because they don't have any skin in the game. Like there's no reason for them not to be honest about what the company's actually like in terms of pros, cons, culture, anything. So I learned a ton about what product management at Udacity is like, what they care about, what doesn't matter to them so much, all sorts of other stuff. What it's like there. What is it even just like to be a product manager? Did you enjoy it? You know, what did you like about it? What did you not like about it? All sorts of stuff. The second thing is that like the reason why it's valuable to talk to people who are not even in that function is that they can still tell you a lot about the company and like what that company cares about. So for example, I could have learned from talking to anybody, not just like an ex-product manager at Udacity, but anybody else who I talked to, all said like, oh, they're pretty open to people from a wide variety of backgrounds. So I could have picked that. I probably could have learned that piece of information pretty quickly. The other thing is that once you have a connection, even just to anybody within the company, now it's a lot more natural for you to follow up at the end of the conversation and say like, thanks so much. This was like super, super helpful. I really appreciate it. You know, I'm actually applying for product manager positions. Do you know anybody who worked in product management there who I could speak to? And even if they didn't work in product management, I don't know, they could have worked in, you know, the marketing team or whatever. They're almost guaranteed to know people, someone, or at least how to get you to somebody in that department. So now you're at least still gonna like, you know, we'll take one more step, but you'll still get there. So anyway, this is basically saying it all comes back to networking again. That you know, you see, so if you want to take the lazy mode, you can just do research online and look at work histories of past employees. But if you want to get the best results, put in the extra time and legwork to talk to people who actually were at that company, and then you'll learn a lot about what they're looking for.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. So a lot of our students obviously are from all over the world, and they want to know if they're trying to apply to work in another city and state, how hard is that? And should they be, you know, relocating, or will employers still consider them if they are living somewhere else and is their first job in the tech industry?
So these are people, it's like they're still applying within the same country, but just like a different location within the country?
Well, we have both. Students who are interested in applying in different countries, but I think this question specifically is about applying to trying to find work in another city or state. That's not close. Will they even be considered?
Yeah. So definitely like a couple things that you can do in this case. So I was very much in that situation as well, for what it's worth. So when I was applying to these marketing jobs at tech startups, I was actually on the East Coast. I was in Boston, and I was applying to like Bay Area internet tech startups. So it's a really different world, completely opposite coast. So I definitely I get sort of the difficulty of trying to convince somebody to talk to you, you know, when you're not in the same place. Okay, so I'll give kind of like the sort of, here's an easy solution, and then here's the best solution that takes more time, but like I really recommend that you go for this, right? The easy solution is like you look for like companies who've specifically said that they are open to remote employees. So for example, like Udacity is we're pretty remote friendly company. Probably about 1 out of every 5 people at Udacity works remotely. And so you'll find that, you know, we have job posts that are explicitly listed as, you know, being open to remote candidates and things like that. And this is like a filter that you can look for on job posts are places that are open to remote work. Okay, that's the easy answer. I encourage you not to settle for that, actually. The best answer is that if somebody really wants you, they're gonna be a lot more open to finding a way to make it work. And there's a couple ways you can do this, but I feel like a broken record, but it again comes back to networking. So what I did when I was, so as an example, the Bay Area tech like startup scene, there's a lot of hiring people like in the Bay Area, right? It's a very tight-knit little world. And so you can imagine I was like this student out in Boston being like, please talk to me. Like, I'm over here. So I invested time in a couple different things. First of all, I definitely still invested time in getting intros in general, which we've already covered. But I also actually spent some time flying out to the Bay Area. I would find ways to end up out here, and I would line up like coffees and chats with people. Because there's really no substitute for connecting with somebody in person, face to face. Like, you can do an email, right? And then better than that is if you can do like, a phone call. And then better than that is if you can do like a Skype call. But really the best thing that you can do to like really connect with somebody and have them remember you is meet them in person. And in fact, I would actually do, I would even, I knew I was targeting the Bay Area, and I would tell people, I'd look up where their offices were or whatever, and then be like, hey, I'm actually going to be around your office like on Friday. I'm going to be right around the corner. And I come by and say hi. I had no actual plans like to be in that area on Friday. And so if they said no, then that was fine. But if they said yes, then I would figure out a way to be there. So that's how I planned my flights, was I would ask people, I'd be like, so I'm just gonna be right around the corner from you. Like, why don't we just, let's like hang out, go get coffee. And then based on whoever said yes, that's how I would plan all of my trips. That being said, right, if like going out there in person isn't an option, like, again, there is sort of that tier of like, okay, then set up a Skype call, or then set up a phone call, or whatever. There's sort of that tier of like preferred options. But the more that you can convince somebody that like you're the right person for the job, or even just the more that you can plant the seed in their head way ahead of time that you are like enjoyable and bright person and you're interested in this job, and they hopefully will think of you later when a job opening comes up for you, which maybe it doesn't right now, the more and more open you will find people are to you working remotely. Also, don't discount, right, that there are in-between options, right? So it doesn't have to just be like remote or relocate, right? Like, make sure that you bring up options or consider options where it's like, well, are you willing to fly out there every 3 months? Like, is that something you're open to? Because that can make a big difference to a company. Are you willing to fly out there once a month? Are you, so you can find, or, are you willing to, work on site for a period of time? And then, so anyway, just consider that there are intermediate options as well that you can sort of use to your advantage in negotiation.
Sorry, I was moving rooms and you saw me do that. Yeah, I think that it's discouraging sometimes when you feel like you don't, one, meet all the requirements, or two, situations like that where it might be the dream job, but it's in a different city, or I just think we're the first ones to rule ourselves out. Like, no, yes, of course they're not going to consider me because I am in Boston and the job is in San Francisco. But I think that the message is that you've got to have the confidence in yourself and believe that the story you're telling is true and that you really are the best person for the job. And ultimately, they are looking for the best person for the job, and they want to make their lives easier, and they want to find the perfect person. So if you're willing to sell that and understand your story and have the confidence in that, I think that these things come easier. This idea that you're willing to, fly out and you'll be in the area. And right. So I think it gets easier once you understand their perspective and you have confidence in yourself. So now that it's 2:02, sorry for holding you past 2 o'clock. But thank you so much for joining us, Amelia. You had so much wisdom and experience to share. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I think that we got to almost all of your questions. And we will have another webinar for Career Month coming up at 4 p.m. today, PST, so just in 2 hours. And we're going to be talking about professional growth with an alumni here from Udacity. If you want to watch this again, you can watch the recorded version at the same link. So thank you all again for coming, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.